Imagine your country's wealth just, multiplying by a factor of 50, like in a single lifetime. You trade dirt roads for paved coastal highways, and you swap subsistence farming for luxury ecotourism.
Yeah, sounds like the ultimate economic dream.
Right. You finally have the capital to build modern hospitals, universal schools. You win the economic game, or so it seems. But then, right when you think you've escaped the gravity of poverty, you realize you've just stumbled blindfolded, basically, into a completely different, much more complex kind of trap.
It is the ultimate paradox of modernization. I mean, generating wealth solves a very specific set of historical problems, sure, but it immediately engineers a brand new set of existential crises. And the margin for error in navigating that transition is just incredibly thin.
Which brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. For you listening right now, whether you're, an analyst trying to understand emerging markets, a policymaker, or just someone fascinated by how nations actually evolve, we are looking at the unvarnished reality of a nation in transition.
Oh, absolutely.
We are tracking the macroeconomic and social evolution of the Republic of Fiji over this incredible 60-year span, from 1960 all the way to 2024.
And we are doing this by analyzing a really fascinating, highly customized academic presentation outline. What struck me immediately about our source material was the strict instructions given to the visual designer.
Oh yeah, the design brief was intense.
Right. The aesthetic mandate is ruthless. It demands a minimalist white background, no 3D graphics, no excessive decoration, like no background images of beautiful beaches to distract the audience, just pure, stark data, left-aligned, thin gray separators. Very academic.
I actually found that visual constraint to be the perfect metaphor for what we are doing in this conversation. I mean, when we talk about global economics, there's a tendency to hide behind glossy narratives, right?
Stock footage of businessmen shaking hands.
Exactly. Spinning pie charts, neat little political sound bites. But when you strip away that standard corporate gloss, when you remove the grid lines and the bright colors, you are forced to confront the raw mechanics of how a society either thrives or collapses.
Yeah, you're looking at a country desperately trying to escape what economists call the middle income trap. To understand their trajectory, the data on slide 2 of this deck forces us to evaluate 3 distinct pillars.
Okay, lay them out for us.
So we have the structural evolution of their economy, the fundamental well-being of their human capital, and finally, the compounding debt they are racking up with their physical environment and their governance.
Let's start by unpacking that core concept, actually.
Yeah.
Because the middle income trap is a phrase that gets thrown around a lot in financial media, but often without much explanation. Before we get into Fiji's specific data, what is the actual mechanism of this trap? Like, why do countries get stuck?
Think of it like a startup company that got incredibly successful by manufacturing one very cheap, simple product. Because their labor was cheap, they dominated the market, they made millions, they pulled themselves out of the garage.
Right, they get into a nice corporate park.
Exactly. That represents a developing nation using cheap labor or raw resource extraction to pull itself out of poverty and hit middle income status.
But eventually, the employees of that startup are going to want a raise.
Yes, and they deserve one. As the country's wealth increases, the citizens demand better wages, better housing, better schools. Suddenly, their labor isn't cheap anymore. They can no longer compete with the poorer countries who are still making that cheap product.
So they lose their edge.
Totally. To survive and keep growing, the startup has to completely pivot. They need to start producing high-tech software or advanced pharmaceuticals or premium services. They have to compete with the high-income, advanced economies.
But they don't have the engineers or the infrastructure or the institutional strength to do that yet. So they are caught in the middle. Too expensive to compete at the bottom, but not advanced enough to compete at the top.
That is the middle income trap. Escaping it requires a fundamental rewiring of the entire nation's economy and society. You can't just keep doing what got you out of poverty. You have to metamorphose.
And that brings us to the bedrock of Fiji's story, how they changed the way they make money. Because the overarching macroeconomic data points to a massive, undeniable surface-level success.
Oh, the growth is staggering.
Right. On slide 3, we are looking at this deep blue area line chart tracking gross national income, or GNI per capita. In the early 1960s, Fiji's GNI per capita was sitting at roughly $211. $211 a year. Let's ground that in reality. What does a $211 a year economy actually look like on the street level?
It looks like a largely agrarian, subsistence-leaning society. It means a significant portion of the population is growing their own cassava, fishing in the local reefs, building their own structures.
So very little hard cash is actually changing hands in everyday life.
Exactly. When people are primarily consuming what they produce, rather than buying it in a formal marketplace, the economic output measured by things like GNI remains very low.
But as we trace the data across the decades, especially crossing the threshold of the year 2000, there's a huge upward arrow on the chart. The trajectory just accelerates wildly. The income shoots upward, eventually breaking the $11,000 mark in recent years.
It's exponential.
They moved from $211 to over $11,000, landing them solidly in the upper middle income bracket. I mean, that implies a total societal transformation.
It does. A transition to an $11,000 per capita economy means the grandson of that subsistence farmer is now working as a logistics manager at a major resort. He's buying imported Australian beef at a supermarket. He's paying for a data plan on a smartphone.
This society has become deeply monetized.
Yes, but the raw number alone doesn't explain the engine behind it. To understand how they generated that wealth, we have to look at slide 4, the structural metamorphosis of the industries driving it.
And this data paints a very clear picture of an economy shifting its center of gravity. We're looking at this 3-color stacked area chart. In 1960, agriculture, forestry, and fishing accounted for nearly 38% of Fiji's entire economy. Almost 4 out of every $10 generated came from pulling something out of the earth or the ocean.
A massive chunk.
But today, that agricultural footprint has collapsed down to somewhere between 10 and 13%.
Meanwhile, the service sector, driven massively by international tourism, hospitality, retail, transport, has ballooned to fill that void. This is the classic modernization pathway.
Right.
As a nation attempts to scale its wealth, agriculture usually retreats because it is fundamentally a low-margin, geographically limited endeavor.
Yeah.
I mean, you can only grow so much sugarcane on a fixed acreage of island soil, and the global price of sugar is volatile.
Whereas with tourism, you aren't exporting a physical crop. You are importing wealthy foreigners who bring capital directly to your shores, and you are selling them an experience.
Yes, and that service economy has a much, much higher ceiling for wealth generation. However, and this is a big however, this pivot introduces a terrifying new vulnerability.
Okay, yeah.
When you transition from feeding yourself to serving global tourists, you change your entire relationship with the rest of the world.
Which perfectly sets up slide 5, the data on international trade dependency.
Yeah.
I have to say, this metric blew my mind. The data tracks trade as a percentage of GDP, and it shows Fiji's dependency violently fluctuating between 60% and 100% over the decades.
It has a wildly volatile chart, a combination bar and line graph showing massive swings.
Wait, I want to make sure I completely understand the mechanics here for my own sanity and for everyone listening. If trade dependency hits 100% of GDP, does that literally mean every single dollar circulating in the country is tied to an import or an export?
Not exactly every single dollar, just because of how the math works. But it means the value of the trade is equal to the value of the entire domestic economy.
Okay, break that down for me.
The formula is simple. Total imports plus total exports, divided by the gross domestic product. If an island produces $100 million in domestic value, but they export 50 million's worth of goods and services and import 50 million worth of goods, their trade dependency is 100%.
So it's a measure of exposure. It shows how massive the front door of their economy is compared to the house itself.
That's a brilliant way to phrase it. Yeah. Fiji is a classic small, open island economy. They simply do not have a domestic population large enough to buy everything they could theoretically produce, nor do they have the natural resources to manufacture modern goods like cars, computers, or, MRI machines.
Right, they can't build that stuff locally.
Exactly. Therefore, they must leave the front door wide open. They have to integrate into the global market just to survive.
They import the diesel to run the hotel generators. They import the frozen French fries for the resort menus, and they export the tourism experience to pay for it all.
Yes.
But that high trade dependency means they are essentially strapping their local economy to the roller coaster of global events.
It's a massive double-edged sword. When the global economy is booming, foreign capital floods in, and that GNI number rockets toward $11,000. But if there's a financial crisis in Australia or New Zealand, which are, the primary source markets for their tourists, the hotels empty out overnight.
And the revenue just evaporates.
Poof, gone. If global supply chains falter and the price of shipping fuel triples, the cost of basic survival on the island skyrockets.
And if a global pandemic grounds all international flights, the main engine of the country just stalls out completely. They traded the low-yield, insulated security of growing their own food for the high-yield, hypervolatile reality of a globally integrated service economy.
That is the macroeconomic gamble they took. And, it paid off in top-line wealth. But macroeconomics is ultimately just the study of human behavior scaled up to a national level. Having established how the money is made, we must ask, who is doing the work?
Exactly.
And more importantly, is that new wealth actually trickling down to the people on the ground?
This brings us to the demographics, this fascinating concept of the demographic dividend on slide 6. The data tracks something called the youth dependency ratio over the 60-year span, and it shows a very smooth, steady decline.
A nice, gentle downward slope.
Let's walk through the mechanics of this because it seems to be the hidden fuel source for that massive economic growth we just talked about.
To understand the youth dependency ratio, you have to look at the population in two buckets. You have the working age adults who generate income and pay taxes, and you have the dependents, usually children under 15, who require resources but don't produce capital.
Okay.
In the 1960s, Fiji, like many developing agrarian societies, had a very high birth rate. Therefore, the ratio of dependent children to working adults was exceptionally high.
Let's put that into a street-level perspective for you listening. Imagine a household in 1970 where there are 2 working adults, but they have 6 young children. Every single dollar, every ounce of energy that those 2 adults produce goes immediately toward basic survival.
Yeah.
Feeding, clothing, sheltering those 6 dependents.
There's nothing left.
Right. There is absolutely nothing left over at the end of the month to put into a savings account, to invest in a new business, or to upgrade their home. They are running on a treadmill just to stay in place.
Now multiply that household dynamic across an entire country. The national savings rate is practically zero. There is no domestic capital available in the local banks to lend out to entrepreneurs who want to, say, build a hotel or start a tour company.
But then the transition begins.
Yes. As basic healthcare improves and infant mortality drops, which we will discuss shortly, and as urbanization shifts families away from farms where children are needed for labor, the birth rates naturally begin to fall. Fast forward a generation or two. Now, that same household still has 2 working adults, but they only have 1 or 2 children.
Suddenly the math changes completely. They aren't spending 100% of their income on basic survival. They have disposable income. They start putting money into local bank accounts.
And this is the crucial mechanism. Those domestic savings pool together in the financial system. The banks now have a massive reservoir of capital that they can lend out to fund infrastructure, small businesses, commercial development.
Wow.
At the exact same time, you have a massive surge of young adults entering the workforce without being weighed down by a huge number of dependents. That dual force surplus labor and surplus capital is the demographic dividend. It is the rocket fuel that allowed Fiji to physically build out their service economy.
So the demographics align perfectly with the economic restructuring. They had the people and the savings ready precisely when the global tourism market started to boom. I mean, it sounds like a beautifully synchronized success story.
It does, until we apply a more critical lens to the data. And this is where the minimalist, unvarnished nature of our source material becomes so powerful, it doesn't let us get comfortable with the top-line success.
It really doesn't.
Right next to the data on the demographic dividend, there is a sobering counter-narrative about who actually got to participate in that new wealth.
Yeah, slide 7 visualizes this using a dumbbell plot, a chart that tracks the gap between 2 different groups over time, focusing on men versus women in what is classified as vulnerable employment. Despite the country's wealth growing 50-fold, despite the massive shift to modern services, the proportion of women trapped in vulnerable employment has remained stubbornly frozen.
Yeah, the chart just circles this massive, persistent gap.
It has hovered right around 36 to 40% for decades. It's just a flat line of inequality.
To understand the severity of this, we need to define vulnerable employment functionally, because it sounds like a sterile economic term, but the reality is incredibly precarious. Vulnerable employment generally encompasses unpaid family workers or solo self-employed individuals operating entirely in the informal economy.
So we aren't talking about a woman working at a tech startup without a 401k.
No, no. We're talking about a woman running a small, unregulated vegetable stall in a local market, earning day-to-day cash with zero predictability, or a woman doing intense, undocumented domestic labor for wealthier families, or a woman doing the invisible, unpaid labor on a family farm while her husband takes a formal wage-paying job at a coastal resort.
And there's no safety net.
Zero. These roles offer no legal protections. There's no sick leave, no maternity leave, no pension, no unemployment insurance, and no recourse if they are suddenly injured or let go.
Why did this happen, though? If the demographic dividend freed up capital and the service economy created all these new formal jobs in hotels and logistics, why didn't the rising tide lift these boats? Why did nearly 40% of the female workforce get left behind in the informal sector?
Because macroeconomic growth does not automatically dismantle structural or cultural barriers. I mean, a new luxury resort might create 500 new jobs, but if societal norms dictate that women must remain the primary caregivers for the elderly, they cannot take those fixed-hour formal jobs.
Oh, wow.
If the educational pipelines for higher-paying administrative roles implicitly favor men, the women are locked out of the upward mobility.
It proves that you cannot simply grow your way out of inequality. You can expand the GDP all you want, but without targeted, deliberate institutional interventions like subsidized childcare, strict labor laws enforcing equal opportunity, or targeted microloans for female entrepreneurs, that gender gap will remain fossilized in the data.
It is a profound lesson for any nation trying to escape the middle income trap. You cannot optimize your economy if you are structurally sidelining half of your human capital. And this naturally transitions us into the deeper evaluation of that human capital.
The third pillar of the framework.
Exactly. Beyond the labor market, what is the fundamental quality of life for these citizens? To assess that, we have to look at the bedrock of society: education and public health.
Let's start with the cognitive infrastructure, because slide 8 highlights an enormous sustained victory. We're looking at this dot-based slope graph tracking primary school retention rates, specifically the percentage of children who enter the school system and successfully make it to grade 5. The data shows this rate consistently locking in above 90% and just staying there.
We mentioned earlier that escaping the middle income trap requires a society to pivot. Think about the mechanical requirements of a service-oriented, tourism-driven economy. If your economy is based on subsistence farming, formal literacy is helpful, but not strictly required for survival. You learn the agricultural rhythms from your community.
But you cannot run a modern hotel without a literate staff. You need people who can manage booking software, read inventory manifests, communicate with international tourists in a standardized way.
Perform basic accounting.
Exactly.
A 90+% retention rate in primary education means the government successfully built a baseline of cognitive infrastructure across the entire population. They created a workforce that was trainable and adaptable. Without that educational foundation, the foreign capital that wanted to build resorts in Fiji would have just gone elsewhere because they wouldn't have been able to staff their operations locally.
And parallel to that cognitive infrastructure, we see an absolute triumph in public health on slide 9. This was one of the most striking data points in the entire deep dive for me. We were looking at female infant mortality rates on this stark black line graph.
It's a dramatic visual.
In 1970, the data shows a devastating reality. Roughly 35.5 deaths per 1,000 live births. But over the ensuing 50 years, the line on this chart plummets in a steep, undeniable downward trend, landing at around 14 deaths per 1,000 in the 2010s.
You have to pause and respect what that data represents. That line dropping isn't just an economic statistic. It is tens of thousands of lives saved. It represents
building rural health clinics.
Yes. Rolling out nationwide vaccination programs, improving maternal care, and investing in clean water and basic sanitation to fight off infectious diseases like cholera or dysentery.
It's the ultimate validation that at least some of that leap from $211 to $11,000 per capita was spent exactly where it should have been spent, protecting the most vulnerable citizens at the very beginning of life.
It is a massive achievement, but, and this is where the narrative takes a profoundly dark and complex turn.
Yeah. I remember reviewing the source material, feeling this huge sense of optimism about the education retention and the infant mortality victories, and then slide 10 just hits you with a stark warning symbol. There's an actual exclamation point hovering over the data on a slide titled "The Epidemiological Transition." If the healthcare infrastructure is drastically improved and people are surviving infancy, why is there a massive red flag over the nation's health?
Because of what public health experts call the paradox of modernization. We talked about how Fiji successfully conquered the traditional infectious diseases that caused high infant mortality, but as they modernized their economy, they fundamentally altered the way their citizens live, work, and eat.
Right.
And in doing so, they inadvertently rolled out the red carpet for a completely new set of killers.
Non-communicable diseases, or NCDs.
Yes. Let's look at the mechanics of this transition. When 38% of your economy is agriculture, a huge portion of your population is engaging in intense daily physical labor. They are moving constantly. Furthermore, they are eating traditional, locally sourced foods, root vegetables, fresh fish, coconuts.
But then the economic gravity shifts to the service sector.
Right. The younger generations move away from the farms to work in the coastal tourist hubs or urban centers. They take jobs working behind a reception desk or driving a taxi or sitting in a logistics office. Their daily physical caloric burn drops precipitously.
And because the agricultural sector has shrunk, the country isn't producing enough local food to feed everyone cheaply, which forces them to rely on that massive trade dependency we discussed earlier. They have to import their calories.
And what is the most economically efficient, shelf-stable calorie to import across an ocean? Processed foods, white rice, instant noodles, canned corned beef, sugary beverages. These products are cheap, they don't spoil in the tropical heat, and they are extremely calorically dense.
So you have a population that has rapidly transitioned from high physical activity and fresh diets to highly sedentary labor and highly processed sodium and sugar-heavy diets.
The result is an absolute explosion of NCDs. The data points to surging rates of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and obesity. The visual in the presentation uses a waffle chart, a grid of squares representing total deaths, and a terrifying proportion of those squares are shaded in to represent NCD fatalities. It's a completely different kind of epidemic.
And it is uniquely devastating to an emerging economy because of the long-term mechanics of the diseases. I mean, if a child contracts a severe infectious disease, the outcome, tragic or successful, is usually resolved fairly quickly. But NCDs like diabetes or heart disease are chronic. They don't kill you immediately. They slowly degrade your health over decades.
Which means the patient requires years of expensive pharmaceuticals, complex surgeries, insulin, dialysis.
The tragic irony here is that the healthcare system Fiji built with its new wealth was designed to deliver babies and administer vaccines. It was not built to manage a nationwide epidemic of chronic, lifelong metabolic diseases.
Precisely. So the health dividend they fought so hard to win in infancy is now being completely devoured in adulthood. The NCD crisis is acting as a massive financial drain on both the state and the individual families.
It's an incredible insight. They navigated their way out of the low-income agrarian trap only to walk right into a modern, middle-income metabolic trap. The very modernization that made them rich is now making them sick.
And the costs of this modernization aren't just biological. They are deeply structurally environmental. Which brings us to the fourth pillar of our analysis, nature's ledger.
This section of the data is where the clinical white background aesthetic of the presentation feels the most intense. It feels like an auditor handing you a bill you didn't know you were racking up. Slide 11 introduces a macroeconomic metric that I think is absolutely vital for anyone listening to grasp: adjusted net savings.
It is a brilliant, highly critical metric that attempts to find the truth behind the illusion of GDP. Traditional economic metrics like gross domestic product basically just ask a simple question: how much money did we make this year? It treats all revenue as good revenue.
Right, regardless of how you got it.
Exactly. But adjusted net savings asks a much more difficult, holistic question. What is our true wealth generation if we subtract the permanent damage we are doing to our physical home and add the investments we make in our people?
It forces the ledger to recognize the depreciation of natural capital. And when you look at the sub-data for CO2 emission damages in Fiji, the numbers are shocking. The charts show a single color bar growing from the zero line. The cost of this damage sits at virtually zero in the early decades, and then it just rockets upward, hitting over $63 million in recent years.
Let's trace the causality there. As the economy industrialized, as more citizens bought cars, as the tourism sector demanded 247 air conditioning and massive amounts of electricity generated by imported fossil fuels, the national carbon footprint expanded. And carbon emissions have a highly quantifiable economic damage cost.
I was trying to come up with a functional analogy for this, and it feels exactly like running a business that looks wildly profitable on paper. Your top-line revenue is soaring, the investors are happy, you are throwing big parties. But the only reason you are profitable was that you are secretly racking up massive, high-interest credit card debt to keep the lights on and buy inventory.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
Because that debt is hidden off the main balance sheet, everyone celebrates. But in the background, the interest is compounding, and eventually the bill comes due.
That analogy hits the nail on the head. The $63 million in CO2 damage is the interest compounding on that hidden environmental credit card. And for a small island nation in the Pacific, that bill isn't just a financial inconvenience, it is an existential threat. We are talking about rising sea levels eroding the very coastal real estate where their luxury resorts are built.
Wow.
We are talking about the increased frequency of catastrophic cyclones that can wipe out years of infrastructure development in a single afternoon. We are talking about ocean acidification and coral bleaching that destroys the marine ecosystems tourists fly thousands of miles to see.
The very engine of their wealth is predicated on a stable climate, but the process of generating that wealth is contributing to the destabilization of that climate. And it gets even more direct when we look at slide 12, the data on natural resource extraction. We see this diverging bar chart that reveals wild, volatile spikes in economic losses due to the extraction of minerals and net forest depletion. There are specific years highlighted with these shadow circles where the economic loss from depleting these resources reaches into the tens of millions of dollars.
This highlights another classic vulnerability for developing nations. There is a constant, immense pressure to fund new development. You want to build a new hospital. You want to pave a new highway to connect rural villages. You need hard capital today. And when global commodity prices for timber or minerals spike, the temptation to liquidate your natural assets is overwhelming.
You just log the ancient forest or open up a massive open pit mine. It provides a massive immediate injection of cash into the government coffers.
Yes, but it is a fundamental illusion of growth. It is quite literally depleting the vault. A forest is not just a warehouse of timber waiting to be sold. It is a highly complex ecological asset. It prevents topsoil from washing into the ocean and choking the coral reefs. It regulates the local microclimate. It acts as a natural water filtration system.
So when you aggressively log that forest for a quick cash injection, you might get $10 million today, but you permanently destroy that asset's ability to provide $2 million of free ecological services every single year for the next century.
Exactly. Relying on raw resource extraction for short-term revenue makes the long-term economy incredibly fragile. Because eventually, the minerals run out, the forests are gone, the quick revenue drops to zero, but the environmental devastation, the eroded soil, the polluted rivers, the loss of biodiversity remains on the ledger forever.
So if we pull back and look at the adjusted net savings holistically, we see this brutal tug of war. The immense economic gains generated by the modern service sector and the high education retention are constantly fighting against the massive gravitational pull of compounding CO2 damage, the exploding healthcare costs of the NCD epidemic, and the irreversible liquidation of forests and minerals.
Which brings us to the most critical question of all. Who is actually managing this incredibly delicate balance? When a nation faces crises of this magnitude, the quality of its institutions becomes the deciding factor between survival and collapse. That brings us to the final section, the institutional anchor.
On slide 13, the data puts Fiji's governance under the microscope using the Worldwide Governance Indicators, or WGI. And the visual representation tells the story of a state apparatus that is really wrestling with its own administration. On one hand, the metric for control of corruption oscillates entirely in positive territory, moving between 0.1 and 0.69.
Above the zero line.
Right. That suggests commendable, sustained efforts to keep systemic graft in check. But then you look at the metric for government effectiveness, and it is wobbling precariously. It hovers right around the zero line, fluctuating between negative 0.1 and positive 0.3.
That data point, the wobble in government effectiveness, is deeply revealing. It tells the story of a public sector that is trapped in a difficult, ongoing reform period. The institutions in Fiji are undeniably resilient. They have, after all, managed a massive 60-year economic transition without state collapse. But hovering near zero in effectiveness indicates that the bureaucracy is struggling to keep pace with the complexity of the modern problems they have created.
Let's translate that wobble into reality. What does low government effectiveness actually look like when you are trying to solve these massive issues?
It looks like incredible friction in policy implementation. The central government might pass a brilliant, well-funded initiative to tackle the diabetes epidemic by subsidizing local agriculture. But if government effectiveness is low, the funds might get bottlenecked in bureaucratic red tape. The distribution of agricultural equipment might be delayed by a year. The rural health clinics might not receive the updated training manuals.
So, in the case of climate change, they might secure international funding to build seawalls to protect coastal infrastructure, but the permitting process takes so long, and the interdepartmental communication is so poor that the next cyclone hits before the concrete is even poured.
Precisely. You cannot combat a nationwide metabolic health crisis or rebuild a climate-resilient power grid with a sluggish, low-capacity bureaucracy. Complex, modern crises require highly agile, highly capable public institutions.
And that stark reality brings us to the climax of the presentation, slide 14. The designer takes all of these disparate threads, the massive wealth generation, the trade vulnerability, the gender inequality, the health paradox, and the environmental debt, and plots them onto a classic 2x2 matrix.
Picture a simple conceptual grid. The horizontal axis measures economic achievement, tracking things like GDP growth and education levels. The vertical axis measures potential risk, tracking the NCD crisis, trade dependency, and climate vulnerability.
And where does Fiji land on this grid? They are plotted squarely in the upper right quadrant. High economic achievement, high potential risk, framed right there in a dashed box.
It is the perfect synthesis of their 60-year journey. They stand at the ultimate middle-income crossroads. They achieved the miracle. The service economy is booming, per capita wealth has skyrocketed, and their population is educated. But they are completely entangled in a web of severe risks. If they maintain the status quo, if they keep relying purely on tourism, importing processed foods, and ignoring the creeping environmental cost, that high risk will eventually crush their economic achievements.
So if you are the government, what do? I mean, you can't just accept the risk and hope for the best.
You have to execute a second metamorphosis. The final slide, slide 15, outlines a strategic playbook. It mandates 3 specific, highly urgent policy recommendations to guide Fiji, or honestly any nation in a similar position, out of this high-risk quadrant.
Let's walk through the mechanics of each one. The cards on the slide lay out recommendation number 1, economic diversification.
The overarching lesson of their trade dependency data is that over-reliance on a single industry is a national security threat. When up to 100% of your GDP is tied to global trade and travel, a single geopolitical event or global recession can wipe out your economy. They must systematically dilute the dominance of the tourism sector.
But how do they do that if they don't have the land mass for massive manufacturing?
They pivot toward high-value, low-carbon, weightless industries. They need to leverage that 90+% primary education retention rate and build out a digital services sector. They can focus on sustainable, high-yield niche, agriculture exporting premium organic products rather than bulk commodities. They need to create multiple diverse engines of wealth so that if the tourism engine stalls, the ship doesn't sink.
That makes total sense. And that brings us to recommendation number 2, social inclusion. And this ties directly back to that dumbbell plot, showing the stubbornly high rates of women trapped in vulnerable employment.
A nation cannot achieve its maximum economic potential, nor can it transition to high-tech industries, if 40% of its female workforce is isolated in the informal economy, completely unprotected by labor laws. The data demands aggressive institutional intervention.
What does that intervention actually look like on the ground?
It means passing and strictly enforcing labor laws that formalize the informal sector. It means the state must provide targeted social safety nets, like subsidized childcare, which frees women from unpaid domestic labor and allows them to enter formal, wage-paying roles. It means creating microcredit facilities specifically designed to help female market vendors scale their businesses into formal enterprises. You have to actively build ramps to bring everyone onto the ship, rather than just hoping they figure out how to swim behind it.
I love that visual. And finally, recommendation number 3, a green strategy.
This is perhaps the most urgent. The government must take that $63 million of compounding CO2 damage and fundamentally bake it into their national accounting. They can no longer treat environmental destruction as an invisible, externalized cost.
So if a foreign developer wants to, say, clear a mangrove forest to build a new mega resort, the government has to look at the adjusted net savings. They have to calculate the long-term cost of losing that mangrove's flood protection and fish breeding capabilities and charge the developer for that total loss rather than just celebrating the short-term construction jobs.
Yes, a green strategy means shifting the entire paradigm. Natural capital, the coral reefs, the forests, the fresh water, must be managed as the nation's most valuable, long-term, wealth-generating assets, not as short-term cash piñatas to be smashed open whenever the budget runs low. It also mandates the rapid deployment of climate-adaptive infrastructure because the storms are only going to get worse.
As we zoom out and wrap up this deep dive, I want to bring this massive 60-year data set back to you, the listener. Why does an academic presentation on the macroeconomic evolution of Fiji matter to your life or your work? Well, because whether you are a global policy analyst, an investor looking for sustainable emerging markets, or simply a curious mind trying to make sense of how the modern world operates, Fiji's story is the perfect microcosm of the ultimate 21st century struggle. Every country on Earth is trying to figure out how to balance the desperate need for rapid wealth generation with the absolute necessity of long-term ecological and social survival.
It is the ultimate tightrope walk, and it brings us right back to the aesthetic of the source material. Remember the strict instructions given to the designer. A stark, minimalist white background, no decorative distractions, no glossy 3D pie charts to hide behind.
Just the unvarnished reality.
I think that visual aesthetic is a warning for all of us. When the environmental bill finally comes due, and when the global trade winds violently shift, a country cannot hide behind the flashy graphics of top-line GDP numbers. We all have to look at the stark reality of our adjusted net savings.
But looking at Fiji's incredible pivot over the last 60 years, from an agrarian society to a modern service economy, leaves me with one final, deeply unsettling question about the future. Fiji managed to escape poverty by leaning heavily into human-driven services, administration, and hospitality. They trained their youth to do the jobs that the advanced economies wanted to pay for.
The classic escape route.
Right. But as we sit here today, we are watching the explosive rise of artificial intelligence. And AI is specifically designed to automate those exact cognitive, administrative, and customer service tasks. If the service economy can be outsourced to an algorithm, it raises a terrifying prospect. Is the 60-year path that Fiji walked the last time this specific economic miracle will ever be possible? For the next developing nation trying to escape the trap tomorrow, will that door to the service economy be permanently bolted shut by AI?
That is a staggering question. If the rungs of the ladder are automated away, how does the next country climb?
It fundamentally changes the rules of the game. And on that incredibly complex note, that's our deep dive for today. Keep looking past the glossy charts, and we'll see you next time.